We work with them to provide fully funded carrier cellular augmentation. So I spent a lot of time here talking to owners and managers of Class A buildings about needs for coverage and capacity. I'm very glad to moderate this panel and share ideas and hear from our guests, what is a smart building. So I'm going to turn it over to Greg to talk about himself and introduce himself, as well as Stacey.
Thanks. So I'm Greg O'Neill. I'm an asset manager with Beacon Capital Partners. We actually own this building as well as 4 others in the Chicago area. We're based out of Boston. We own buildings kind of throughout the United States. I've been with the company for about 3.5 years. My background is all commercial, real estate, office buildings. And we typically buy buildings that have a lot of vacancy or things to fix and improve and then lease them up and sell them. And so adding the right technology and the right design is critical to our success.
Perfect. Thanks, Greg. So my name's Stacey Scapano. I'm a Chief Technology Officer for Skender, a relative recent transplant here to the Chicago area. So still ironing that out, this transition out. Skender's in 2019 is kind of like 2 companies in one. We're a 64-year-old regional builder here in Chicago. But later this month, we'll be actually rolling out our first products out of our advanced manufacturing facility. And about a year or 2 ago, we also acquired an architecture firm here. So we, technically, the way I look at our organization is we have a vertically integrated startup that's going live at the end of the month. And we have this 64-year-old traditional builder that we've got to continue to modernize and respond to the market.
Great, thanks. I guess for both of you, give me your broad couple sentence or a couple paragraph definition of what is a smart building. Do you want to start, Greg?
Yeah, sure. So my definition of a smart building is one that offers maximum flexibility to its tenants. So that includes the design of its amenities, like on this floor, we have this conference room as well as a lounge and a fitness center. And like the lounge, we intentionally designed with all movable furniture. So if there's certain events, you can move the furniture and accommodate any tenants' kind of conferencing needs or requests. Also in space design, like for a tenant's occupancy, having the design today where it's mostly open, you have a lot of collaboration rooms, far fewer offices as you used to have like 10 years ago, a lot of collaboration rooms, conference rooms, as well as just breakout rooms, and just having that open design to offer the maximum flexibility for that next tenant's occupancy. Also, I think having visibility from the landlord side into how the building is being used is critical to a smart building. Being able to match up kind of how the building is being used versus how it's being operated. And I think that's something that's coming along a lot over these past few years with a lot more data and insights on how tenants are coming to the building, what hours they're working, where they're working, are they using the amenities that you're offering or not. So I think that's also critical to a smart building.
I actually think it's even though we've probably heard a number of definitions today, this is my way of dodging the question altogether. It's an evolving concept, and so I think it needs framing. I think that companies that are investing in smart buildings have baseline maturities in that exercise, in that journey. If you look at kind of the history of smart buildings circa 10, 15 years ago, you're really looking at a conversation that was dominated by building automation. And I actually tried my best to quantify this, so I did a Google trend of the use of the term smart building, and you see it frothy because it's an automation conversation a decade ago, and in the last pass, and as soon as 2010 rolls around and we've got mobility on scenes and a bunch of point solutions out in play, you hear a lot of the speakers earlier today talk about this integration phase and solving this kind of disparate systems and systems not talking to systems, and then exposure to cybersecurity. And then as you get to these really interesting players that can kind of capitalize on an insights-driven view of the world and organizational strategies that can capitalize on it, you see kind of this third framing to smart buildings. And I think they're all accurate. And I think maybe the unsaid tensions in the room are that we're all at different places in that maturity model or timeline, if you don't like that kind of lens. And that's the way I'm looking at smart buildings. And to kind of put a caveat on this as well, I also did a trend graph, you know, if you imagine smart buildings since 2004 use on Google look like that. If you Google trend smart homes, you see a hockey stick since 2004. And it gets back to this other kind of expectation, the narrative around experience that we've heard all day long. And I think these notions of this evolution are really important when you're even just trying to make a baseline assessment of where you are with this smart building exercise.
Hey, that's great. Thank you. How would you guys measure success with smart buildings? You know, what are the metrics? What are the ways that we can look at it, whether it's an ROI, productivity, well-being? What are some measurements or metrics that you use to help define success in a smart building strategy?
I'll take a swing at this. I mean, so if you subscribe to that kind of framing that I talked about in those different phases, I think a low common denominator is building efficiency and performance. I mean, if the building's not performing, how smart is it? And that's going to trickle into an ROI in a number of distributed places. Your end tenant and their utility bills, and or your ability to compete based off of how they're perceiving the total cost of occupancy. So I think that's definitely a no-brainer. I definitely appreciate, I believe her name was Darlene from WeWork earlier, flipping the perspective, and I believe it was the McDonald's conversation as well, you know, all the way to this notion of what about my tenants and the critical business needs of their operations. I love the employee retention and attraction conversation, because in one way, shape, form, or another, our buildings are competing next door to each other. We've got different business models and different real estate approaches and strategies there. And to get those healthy occupancy rates up and utilization up for our buildings, it has to be that the value of paying rent is because we've got a workforce that's wanting to use that space, whatever that space may be.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think efficiency is a very good barometer of how smart a building is. And again, I think you need to match up the operations of the building with how it's being used. And so, I'm excited to see technologies come along where it can tell how occupied a certain floor is on a certain day, so that you can trim back the HVAC and you're not just wasting electricity for space that's hardly occupied. Or like in a garage, if on a certain day the garage isn't as full as it typically is, you can instantly lower your parking rates so that that'll attract more parkers. And then also evaluating the tenant satisfaction as well. We do Kingsley surveys every year to track closely our tenant satisfaction. And having a smart building, theoretically you're responding to exactly what the tenants want and need. And so if your tenants have high satisfaction, then theoretically you have a smart building. But having that insight into what the tenants want and need and matching up what you offer to them, I think is critical.
Let's talk for a couple minutes about what do people have wrong? What are the misconceptions about smart buildings? What are the bad ideas? Let's share some bad ideas or things that really don't make sense. Any thoughts on that, Greg?
Yeah, sure. I know one thought that comes to mind recently. We rolled out a program at one of our buildings with like iPad kiosks in the lobby, and we thought tenants would like it, they'd engage with it, and we could track our tenant satisfaction and just ask random questions and just kind of get to know each of the tenants in the building versus all the gatekeepers, which are the the tenant contacts we have. We thought it'd be a good way to interact with each individual tenant. But it turned out that nobody used these kiosks. They walked right by them and engaged with them whatsoever. And I think the reason is that people maybe 10 years ago would be excited to see an iPad in a lobby and they'd touch it and fool around with it. But today they're looking at their phone. And so I think we missed the boat there, where we should have offered that engagement via like a smartphone app or some direct communication with the tenants, as opposed to having just an iPad in a lobby, hoping as a tenant walks by they'd interact with it, because they didn't. So that's just one kind of miss I can think of.
That's great, thanks.
Yeah, for me, the whole premise, and again, trying to echo some of the previous conversations, that smart buildings is really a technology-forward conversation. I think it's implied in the name, but what Darlene was saying about the notion of the use case and pairing that with the strategy of your organization or your customers' organizations is way more important to calibrate where your investments are actually going to lie, how you're going to prioritize that landscape of possibilities that I think somebody was asking about. You can just sit there and wander the halls of Best Buy figuring what piece of tech to buy. Or worse, Amazon.com, or browse the internet, and the challenge that we've had, and sorry if the venture capitalist is in the room from earlier today. I mean, we had 1 to 2 apps on the iPad in our industry as recent as 2011 because the iPad was launched in 2010. You have PropTech now as a VC firm, as we're looking to move capital around from consumer now into our market, and I think CB Insights tracked around 2,200 startups in our space. That is going to fuel a lot of analysis paralysis if you're trying to be tech forward, find the latest and greatest, and try to start there. If you reverse the conversation of what do I need, what do my customers need, and then recalibrate and prioritize that road mapping session, I think it's very interesting how a number of these speakers have been talking about technology pulling to a seat at the table in a more senior capacity to try to unpack our internal organizational strategies as well as how we engage with clients.
Let's talk for a minute or two about strategies and looking at whether it's a retrofit or a new building. What would you guys say are the main drivers of a smart building strategy versus the way traditional non-smart building real estate is done? What are the drivers and tactics that you guys see?
Yeah, sure. I think the drivers for us in the smart building design is the tenants that we see today. 10 years ago, tenants would come in, it was more 9 to 5, and they'd leave. Today, tenants come in, they're working different hours. They're working at different places in the building. Like now, tenant amenities are super important, where tenants can come down, like the lounge down here, and do an hour of work. And so I think having that design where you're accommodating different schedules, different people. I think co-working has clearly blown up over the past several years, and they're responding to a need in the market where tenants wanted more flexibility, and then their employees wanted more flexibility. So I think in the retrofitting buildings like this one, it's responding to just having what the tenants in the market are looking for, which is that flexibility and different places to work, and having those offerings, whether it's co-working within your building plus amenities plus a more traditional space.
Yeah, in attempt to be engaging here right before 5 o'clock, I think the answer to the question of what's driving smart buildings today, I think all roads point to Starbucks. And I mean this in 1,000 different ways, and you could spin it. Howard Schultz, when he founded Starbucks back in the 70s, was just enamored about the Italians sitting down and having coffee. And when he came back to Seattle, he didn't start a coffee company, he started an experience company. And we've talked about this evolution in, are we providing a facility, are we providing a space, are we providing a workforce? Is it an amenity? Is it a coffee product? Or are you actually sitting there, and there's a certain design aesthetic now that the Australian gentleman called it a millennial expectation. I'm going to throw a slight correction to that. If we're looking at the coffee consumption and behavior across the generations that we have, I think it's a population-wide expectation of what we want out of spaces now. And so if I'm going to entertain myself in these types of spaces, if I'm going to design my house to that level of expectation, guess what's influencing these baseline worker expectations to stay in their office, which completely rolls all the way up to the investor conversations. And I hate throwing that out there, but I'd like you to stress test that metaphor and see if I'm wrong.
I used to live in Seattle for 12 years. I've got to throw out, I do love Starbucks, the convenience, the coffee. I don't know if you have them in Chicago, but in Seattle they're piloting, or a couple years ago, they serve booze at night, right? Maybe they do here. So they're trying to get 18 to 20 hours a day of revenue, right? Wi-Fi, booze, coffee, desserts.
Absolutely.
Let's talk for a minute and how you guys, we've talked about the relentless pace of technology and that things are changing on an ongoing basis. How do you keep pace? How do you prioritize? What's your strategy for that with multiple priorities? How do you prioritize?
I'd say check your FOMO at the door. It gets back to, again, Darlene's notion of kind of the visioning conversation. In my world, a digital master plan is something that we've started dealing with in a past life. I was doing a lot of airport work, and those are assets that have a lot of technical debt. They are part of the crumbling infrastructure of the United States and globally, and your assets that need to be smarted up are primarily baggage handling, let alone the elevator conversation and turnstile conversation we were talking about integrating. So you can spend some time pulling in different stakeholders up and down, especially if you can even have a client at that table to really guide and inform and really try to develop a full course menu of what you could be doing, and then sitting down with the critical internal stakeholders of figuring out what's going to move the needle for our business today, and if we solve that and presume success, how will we shift those investments to a different part of the menu? I think it's both a mapping of technologies for the space and a very clinical definition of your smart building opportunity here as a product, but you have to reverse engineer it into, like I said, the maturity of your organization and the direction that your organization is looking to take. And then ultimately there's going to be the cash to fund it conversation that has to rear its ugly head at some point.
Yeah, and for us, I think it's being willing to make that investment and doing some pilot programs. And a lot of technologies won't work, but I think if you're willing to put the work up front to pilot a bunch of different options and programs and see what works, what doesn't. I feel like Beak in our company, we're piloting certain initiatives across our portfolio. One building in each market, for instance, and we want to see what works, what doesn't, and then we implement it for the things that do work and the things that don't work. Kind of fizzle out. It's a lot of work for the building owner and the managers because it's new things you have to learn, and it's kind of a change of the way you used to do business. But I feel like real estate owners have historically been slow to adopt change and technology. But I think that's changing quite a bit over these past probably 3 to 5 years, where you're seeing a lot of these new technologies percolate up and being adopted, and they're working, making buildings far more efficient, saving money on electricity, utilities, and increasing tenant satisfaction.
What would you guys say are the top 2 or 3 challenges in developing a smart building? And you can delineate between a retrofit or a new building. And we've talked about some of those. Budget could certainly be one. Could be shareholder drive, buy-in. It could be other constraints. It could be time. What are the top couple challenges that you see just broadly with a smart building strategy?
The primary thing that I kept hearing over and over again, but was never really explicitly stated today, was this whole notion of data sovereignty. There are probably 13 different business models that I see in the room here today, from spec and flip to own, operate, and then we heard McDonald's shift from own, operate to becoming a tenant. You can't get around the fact that to pull off these integrations, to kind of create and evolve the elegance of the tenant experience, you may have to reach across the aisle to folks that have data that you need, and you need to figure out what that win-win strategy is, and whether that's a tenant or a client, whatever that might be. You've got a full stack to consider. What's going to be your lowest common denominator across the legacy assets in your portfolio and your new premium investments, and you've got to figure out what that low common denominator is. But then you've got to really map out the variability, facility to facility, tenant and community by community, to really rationalize what your opportunities are. It's very hard to generalize a monolithic approach to smart buildings, even for one company, let alone a room of such a mixed audience.
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is just matching up, what tenants want today and what they will want tomorrow with what you're, rolling out today. I think it's super hard to figure that out. I think, bring up co-working, and I think they did a great job of seeing something that a lot of, no landlord did and nobody else had at the time. But that, tenants are looking for flexibility, and they'll be willing to pay a premium for that flexibility, and having the option to move into a building and have a month-to-month lease is, had been unheard of in the industry only, 5, 6, 7 years ago, and now it's far more commonplace. So I think just brainstorming and figuring out what tenants will want, 2 years from now or 3 years from now, so that as a landlord you can be prepared to, develop your building to be positioned to offer that.
So today we've talked a lot about the smart building and the technology pieces and the drivers, things that we can do. We can monitor the environment, temperature, we can use our cell phones and Wi-Fi and all these things. Let me ask and I've got a big stake in this, do you have an opinion on 5G and what does 5G mean to you? What does it mean to your tenants? Any thoughts on that?
I'll take a swing at this. So it's a bigger, faster pipe. And if you really nerd out, which is a very dangerous time in the conference to do this, if you think about kind of computing at a very low level, we've shifted from desktop computing to cloud and mobile technologies. Now we've got sensors everywhere chirping. It's just generating this explosion of data. I don't even know the stats anymore. We're like reauthoring the entire history of the world every 48 hours or something like that in terms of devices creating data upon data. And 5G is interesting because it's allowing us to put automation out on the edge. And there's this whole notion of that sensor isn't just really a smart switch. It's actually thinking and doing on the wall in the next 5 to 10 years. That may end up being what drives your car. That may end up being some decision making that's happening right in the room, and it's turning this room into something that's being monitored to something that's monitoring. And that's a bit of a pivot, and I think that's the promise of 5G. We've got some galactic battles going on with the providers of 5G over time, and our role as a nation. We're looking forward to those investments because it's gonna spawn in so many other industries. The autonomous vehicle conversation being a fascinating one that's one to watch, and then obviously one that's going to influence our real estate decisions.
And as far as 5G, I think like with the DAS systems, tenants now demand it. When we trade proposals with tenants, the more sophisticated ones will ask if we have a DAS system, and if we don't, commit to putting one in. I think 5G will be the same exact way, where if you don't have a 5G DAS system, tenants that are sophisticated, the larger tenants are going to absolutely require that in the building. It's just being rolled out now, but I bet 2-3 years from now, having 5G connectivity in your building will be like an absolute requirement for many tenants.
Kind of to add to that, so our clients are asking us today, the system you're putting in, how is it 5G ready, right? How is it 5G, and how can you guarantee I don't have some level of obsolescence? So I think that's a very good point.
Yeah, we put in a DAS system a couple of years ago, and I'm right now asking myself, is it 5G capable? So hopefully it is. But it's just how quickly technology changes, and being ready to be able to implement the newest technology when it comes out.
Sure. So as we wrap up, and again, everyone can stretch and realize there's happy hour shortly. Couple more questions. Greg and Stacey, if you had to pick just one technology or two that you said, this is what I want, and whatever the cost, whatever the obstacles, what are the one or two things as it relates to smart buildings that you're most excited about?
I would say enhancements in building automation systems that marry up to artificial intelligence. And so, as you're learning about your tenants and their habits, you have a, artificial intelligence that can automatically, bring elevators to the right floor because they know this tenant leaves at a certain hour, so your elevators are super efficient. Or going back to the HVAC, you can, make sure the HVAC isn't running as, as hot or cold on certain days because a certain tenant's not in town. And so I think just more and more enhancements to building automation systems and then marrying that up with artificial intelligence will have pretty big impact.
Yeah, I think I'm really underscoring the same opportunity. I could tell you what I'm not excited about is doing jumping jacks to turn the lights on and off. And I think, which is a 40, 50-year-old infrared technology from World War II. And we still heavily depend on those types of occupancy proxies to inform these enormous investments we're making to almost smart up our buildings and dissatisfy our clients and not provide what we have with artificial intelligence and kind of the new breed of sensors and processing capabilities. We're getting closer to understanding human presence, not who's having a phone that's subscribed to my system, because that's a poor proxy, because I may leave that on my desk when I go to the bathroom. Not badging in and just forcing me to subscribe to the platform. And that's what I meant earlier about the environment beginning to develop its own understanding of itself, and it's really exciting research that's going on, some of the startups that are investing in this space and rolling out some of the technologies.
I think we can open it up to the audience for questions. I see a few curious people out there, people with thoughts or ideas to share. Yes.
This is a fantastic question. My marketing team is going to probably send you a gift card later tonight. For us, before I get to that, I mean, what we're excited about, and some of what we were processing as a group as we were listening to all the speakers today, is these innovations in business model and real estate. You hear the workplace as a service, not co-working narrative today versus are you an on-spec developer? And who's funding, where's your capital? Is it your past performance or is it venture? These aren't apples to apples conversations. So, I mean, you have to kind of pull yourself back. When I did my intro of, hey, look, we're two companies. We're a startup and we're the 64-year-old builder. The startup's there because construction as an industry has bid itself down to low single-digit margins as an industry. And we've got to wiggle our way out of that dysfunctional business model. And one of the ways to do it is to vertically integrate and think about your projects as part of our product portfolio. This gives us the opportunity for economies of scale. My over-design of your project was subsidized by other customers of ours. And it also allows me to start echoing these efficiencies that we can find in manufacturing. Chicago's an easy one. How many snow days are going to mess up your construction schedule? So before I even get to the robot that actually provides the welding on that corner, we're working on the Hyatt House, which is the corporate hotel for the McDonald's building, and that's about ready to top off. And when I walk that site, our traditional teams are doing great, but one of the primary constraints on delivery and inefficiencies is an undersized service elevator that's probably optimized for the second year of occupancy, not the construction schedule that we depended on. In the shop, I have flow to my worker, not moving my worker and materials up to the 12th floor to work on the pool. From there, we're looking at just rapid productivity gains, order something, flow through the shop, how we augment our workers by bringing the information to them, not looking at drawings and interpreting, the repeatability, and then ultimately, there's opportunities to see those bots that have been welding car frames forever to actually be doing the hard weld that normally would be hanging up 13 stories in the air on your project. So lots there, and we're super excited about it. Now, one little tip, though, is when these things are rolling off the line, we're designing the smart product that you're consuming. And so this is one of the ways that hopefully as an opportunity for us and our clients that we can start looking at ways that we can get those economies of scale, that repeatability that helps smart up the products that we're delivering that you're calling a project historically. And that's also a great benefit.
Thank you. Other questions and comments? Yes.
What other technologies are your tenants asking for?
I think, as I said, DAS for sure. Multiple internet carriers. Having internet connectivity, from the roof instead of landlines, in case something dramatic happened and cut all the connectivity into the building. And then also flexibility with HVAC. Being able to call up on demand on your phone to get overtime HVAC requests. Work orders where you can dispatch an engineer just through a typical website, but all that also migrating to having an app on the phone as well. And then as far as it's not really technology, but just offering services to tenants to use, where classes or workout classes or even educational classes like a bartender class or something, kind of offering the enhancing the employee engagement at the building. I think that those are the primary ones.
Other questions before we wrap up? Other thoughts to share? Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Mariel. I'll turn it back to Mariel and to close it out.
Thank you.